At least once in your life, you might experience a moment of pure dread, the kind where your heart feels both aflame and frozen in the last breath you drew, time dragging like molasses. Your stomach tenses, and you swallow a silent scream. Maybe you run, maybe you freeze, or perhaps you brace to fight. For those who know true dread, it digs so deep, it feels like it changes part of you, altering something in your core. I want to tell you about a night in December of 2007. Growing up, I was raised in a deeply Christian household, heavily influenced by my parents' beliefs. At that young age, all the talk about heaven and angels, and just as often about the threat of hell and eternal torment, left a lasting impression on me. It was scary stuff for a 9-year-old. One winter, my family took a trip to a remote cabin in the Utah mountains, deep within a snow-covered forest. We were so high up that my father, suffering from altitude sickness, needed to use a portable oxygen tank. We were isolated, with only one other cabin visible through the trees, maybe 3 acres away. The first night was pleasant. We made a fire, roasted marshmallows, and built a snowman. The cabin was an open-plan build, with a loft on the second floor where my sister and I slept on twin beds, while our dad slept downstairs under the stairs. There was an old couch that smelled faintly like syrup, and I slept on the twin bed closest to the loft's edge. My sister Mia, who was 6, slept on the one further from the edge, while our youngest sibling, Abby, who was 2, stayed with our dad downstairs. I slept well that night, maybe the last good night's sleep I've had since then, even though I'm 24 now. It all started early the next morning with a strange tapping sound. It wasn't like something tapping a table, but more like something heavy and sharp scraping against the floor. At first, I thought it might be my dad, or maybe even a bear, given that we were in the mountains. But I was wrong. The sound was rhythmic, persistent, making me lie completely still in bed. I was in the habit of sleeping with a pillow over my head, which gave me a sense of security, so I felt somewhat hidden. After a while, curiosity got the better of me, and I peeked through a small gap in my pillow to look at the edge of the loft. There, in the dim light, I saw a dark shape near the railing. It looked like a hand with long, bony fingers tapping an extra jointed finger on the wood. A wave of nausea and dread washed over me, making me close my eyes tight and turn away. I repeated to myself that it couldn't be real, whispering quiet prayers for comfort. Eventually, the tension eased, and I dared to open one eye to check. It was gone. Relieved, I faced the wall, next to which sat a small nightstand with an old-fashioned oil lamp. Hidden just beside it was a faint outline of a small square door. It reminded me of the kind of little doors you might see in fairy tales. The wood looked dark, almost burned, like it had been aged over time. The rest of the day was uneventful, but that night is when things truly escalated. Before bed, I asked my dad to leave a light on, fearing another fright. He didn't want to, but he compromised by making a fire in the fireplace, which cast a comforting glow across the room. I watched the flickering shadows on the ceiling until the flames died down, leaving only a dim orange hue. Then, just as I closed my eyes, that tapping sound returned. But this time it was coming from in front of me, behind that tiny door. At first, I thought it was a branch scraping the roof. But soon, the noise grew louder, unmistakably coming from behind the door. I glanced over, terrified but too curious to look away. Sharp, thin fingers appeared, curling through the small gap around the frame. The door began to shake, a loud scratching sound echoing from within. My sister stirred in her bed, perhaps hearing the noise too, while I prayed silently. Then the fire went out, The cabin was plunged into darkness, and I lay frozen, convinced my sister was awake too, hoping she'd call for our dad. A loud bang startled me, followed by more tapping. Each bang felt like a hammer striking my chest, my pulse matching its rhythm. My sister finally awoke, and with a groggy voice, she told whatever it was to stop. I held my breath as she reached out, thinking it was me, but it wasn't. Whatever was tapping was now on my bed. Mia screamed, her piercing voice breaking the silence. I dared not move, tears streaming down my face, while something sat on the edge of my bed, still tapping. I squeezed my eyes shut, too scared to open them, repeating Bible verses under my breath. I prayed harder than I ever had, desperate for the creature to go away. Suddenly, the pounding on the door stopped, and I heard the unmistakable thud of my dad's footsteps on the stairs. He was calling out to us, and for a moment, I felt a surge of relief. But the creature didn't leave. Instead, it moved, shifting closer. I could feel the blankets pull as its claws got caught on the fabric, inching toward me. With a final bang, the door burst open, and in the darkness, two hollow, inky eyes stared back at me from a pale face. Its mouth stretched wide, far too wide, filled with sharp teeth. The creature leapt from my bed, and I heard it land on the floor. The last thing I remember is seeing my dad fighting with the creature before he collapsed from its impact, and the creature vanished into the night. When help arrived hours later, the park rangers and rescue team found us huddled together in shock. My dad was injured but alive, and my sisters were shaken but safe. I never looked away from that door until they pulled me from the cabin. Even now, years later, the image of those dark, hollow eyes still haunts me. My family and I never talk about what happened in that cabin, and I've grown skeptical of the supernatural. But sometimes, in the corner of my vision, I see those long, bony fingers curling around a door frame, as if waiting. One chilly autumn night, my friend and I found ourselves venturing deep into the woods, far from any neighbors, at their family's isolated cabin. The cabin was narrow, with rooms lined up shotgun style, and not another house for miles around. Seeking a thrill, we decided to experiment with a Ouija board. It was close to midnight, maybe between 11:30 and 12, and the darkness around us felt heavy as we gathered around the board, hoping to connect with the otherworldly. To our surprise, the planchette moved, spelling out the name Alex, the name of my friend's boyfriend. A tense silence fell over us as we continued asking the spirit questions. The answers spelled out slowly, each letter unsettling us further. Then, in a bone-chilling moment, the board spelled out a sinister message. It wanted Alex gone, using the letters DIE. Our nerves shot. We quickly ended the session and bid goodbye to whatever was there. Shaken, but still curious about the paranormal, we decided to try something different. We wrote a note and slipped it under the door of an empty room in the cabin, hoping for a response. To our horror, someone or something wrote back, expressing the same malice toward Alex. Disturbed, we tried to clear the cabin of any dark energy, realizing we had likely angered whatever spirits lingered there. Around 3:15 or 3:30 a.m., I decided it was time to leave. My friend walked me out to my car, which was only about 30 feet from the cabin's porch. I drove off, and about 4 miles down the road, I reached a crossroads. That's when my phone buzzed. It was a video call from my friend. Answering, I could tell something was wrong. They seemed shaken, asking if I had come back. I told them I was miles away, showing them on the call that I was still in my car. My friend, their voice trembling, told me that they could hear someone outside the cabin door, sounding exactly like me, pleading to be let in. Trying to show them it wasn't me, I held up my phone to confirm my location. But on the other end, they could hear me, or something imitating me, begging for entry, even warning that there was something dangerous outside. To validate, my friend placed their phone near the front door. Through the phone speaker, I heard a chilling replica of my own voice pleading, saying it needed to get inside for safety. Growing more desperate, the imitation voice began calling out, then splitting into multiple voices, all sounding like me. It started shouting and trying to lure my friend into the dark woods, pretending it was me and calling out for help. I sat in my car, frozen, listening helplessly as these eerie voices echoed through my car's speakers. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the sound stopped, leaving my friend and me rattled and fearful. To this day, we don't know what we encountered that night, but we both believe it had something to do with the Ouija board. We learned the hard way that some doors are best left closed. Coleman was one of my favorite places to visit. It was nestled by a saltwater lagoon near the edge of Oregon, close to the Washington border. The cabins had decks that overlooked a narrow stretch of land between the sea and the lagoon, but ours was the closest to everything. My cabin friends and I were all around 13 years old, just like me. On our first night there, we played poker out on the deck, betting with snacks and other little things we brought. Suddenly, a disturbing sound, like metal scraping across glass, but much louder and higher pitched, filled the air. We all froze. The sound seemed to come from every direction. We rushed inside, telling our cabin leaders what we'd heard, but they brushed it off, suggesting it could be a group of coyotes. Still, we felt something was off. Later that night, while everyone was sleeping, I woke up to that same eerie sound. I wasn't alone. Two of my cabin mates were also awake. We decided that the next day, we'd go to the camp library. The library had a kiosk by the entrance with recordings of all the animals in the area. We searched for anything that could match the noise we'd heard, but nothing did. We asked around to see if other cabins had heard it, but no one else had. That night, we were so nervous to return that we even volunteered to help clean up after dinner just to delay going back. When we finally had to return to the cabin, we prepared for bed, hoping not to hear the sound again. We shut all the windows and locked the doors. But that night, we heard it once more, louder this time and somehow closer. Each night that week, it only seemed to come nearer and nearer. The following Saturday, I confided in my closest friend that we should stay up to try to figure out where the sound was coming from. We stayed up quietly reading and passing notes to each other. Just after midnight, the noise erupted from somewhere near the back door, but it seemed like only we could hear it. No one else woke up. We were terrified but decided to peek out onto the deck. I'll never forget what we saw. A figure with a skeletal body, long limbs ending in claw-like fingers, swaying by the lagoon. It had no visible face, just a dark, shadowy shape that moved almost like an animal on all fours. Then, just as suddenly, it faded into the shadows. After that night, the sound never returned for the rest of the summer, but I can still picture that figure clearly in my mind. I often wonder what it was lurking in that lagoon. Hopefully, I'll never have to find out. Last summer, I attended a camp in Maine called Lakeview Summer Camp. It was my first time there, and while nothing too scary happened to me personally, there was a story that circulated among my cabin mates that still haunts me. One of the counselors, a man named Dan from Georgia, was the subject of a series of unsettling incidents told by various witnesses. Dan seemed friendly enough. He even let me use his phone charger in exchange for a turn with my fidget spinner. One day, Dan was missing for several hours. Rumors started going around that he had shoved a camper from our cabin into a tree during an argument and was in trouble for it. Things calmed down for a day, but then another incident occurred with a different camper, which led to Dan being permanently removed from the camp. After Dan left, our counselors shared stories about him that really unsettled me. Apparently, Dan had been giving unusual attention to a couple of younger boys, including the one he'd pushed. The stories disturbed everyone, especially one 13-year-old boy who started crying, a rare thing for him. The counselors also told us he'd made inappropriate remarks to other campers. I felt lucky that I'd never been in his focus and that my bed was as far from him as possible, under the watch of a different counselor. I hope I never see Dan again. Whether you're staying in a cabin with friends or on your own deep in the woods, cabins often mean being far from others. And sometimes it feels like you're not alone, whether it's the strange sounds of the night or worse, the unsettling people who sometimes end up there too. I live in Burlington, Ontario, a nice lakeside town not too far from Toronto. This story happened to me during a school trip back in 8th grade at my Catholic elementary school. All the 8th graders got to go on 2 trips as a final year tradition. One was in the fall, usually a religious camping trip about 40 minutes outside the city, with activities focused on team building and Christian values. Honestly, this trip felt like a 3-day religion class. The second trip, usually in the spring, was a weekend visit to Ottawa where we'd explore the city and visit museums. But for some reason, my year was sent on another camping trip instead, this time about 4 hours away at Algonquin Provincial Park. The camp was by one of the lakes in the park, laid out like a typical summer camp. Cabins were scattered near the lake and partially in the woods, with separate buildings for bathrooms and the dining hall. Boys and girls stayed in separate cabins. The girls' cabins were on stilts near the lake, while ours were lower, practically in the woods along a gravel path. I shared a bigger cabin with 4 other guys, but it was the most run down. Our cabin only had bug screens for windows and a flimsy door that didn't fully close, while the other cabins had solid windows and doors that locked. This was actually my first real camping experience, as my family had never been fans of it, so it wasn't the best start. The creepy part started on the first evening. After dinner, we all gathered outside the mess hall for a night activity. The camp counselors told us about a hermit who supposedly lived in the nearby forest. The plan was to take us into the woods in small groups to show us where the hermit lived. It seemed random, but we were all intrigued. So, with only flashlights, we were led deep into the woods looking for the hermit's place, with everyone screaming and laughing along the way. Eventually, we reached what they called the hermit's house, a big fallen log with a makeshift bed inside. After that, we headed back to camp. My group didn't see much, but other campers claimed to have seen someone lurking in the trees. One of my cabin mates even swore he saw glowing blue eyes watching us from the shadows. I brushed it off, thinking it was just a counselor dressed up to give us a scare. In the middle of the night, I was startled awake by the sound of someone running down the gravel path by our cabin. At first, I felt a bit scared, but I thought it might just be an animal. But then I heard quiet footsteps crunching on the gravel outside our cabin. It was subtle, but it sounded like a person. I suddenly felt terrified. My bed was right next to the door that wouldn't lock. If it were an animal, it could have easily pushed the door open. And with only bug screens for windows, whoever was outside could see right in. I prepared myself to scream if someone tried to open the door, staring at it, expecting it to slowly creak open. But it never did, and the footsteps eventually faded away into the forest. I immediately thought it might have been the hermit. I doubted it was a counselor or teacher, as it was around 3 a.m., not a typical time to check on us. Strangely, I managed to fall asleep again. That was the only unusual part of the trip. The rest of the time, it rained constantly, and some classmates caught the flu from another school sharing the camp with us. The bus ride home even had a quarantine section for those who felt sick. Over time, I mostly forgot about the creepy encounter, convincing myself it was just a counselor keeping an eye on us. The story didn't end there, though. The following year, my younger sister went on the same 8th grade trip. Just like my group, she went on the hermit hunt during the first night. She thought it was just a camp story, but during one of the days, she and a few friends went exploring in the woods along the lake. She told me they saw a small, hermit-like figure sitting on a log in the distance. I know this isn't the scariest camping story out there, but it gives me chills to think that the hermit might have been real and that the camp found it amusing to lead kids to a stranger's makeshift home in the woods. It's also unnerving to think that the hermit was bold enough to wander around the cabins at night. It's been almost a decade since this happened, and I haven't gone camping since. Another strange event happened to me and some friends back in 2017. I was 16, and a few of us went on a camping trip with our Boy Scout troop. The first night was just the usual setup and unpacking, and we picked a spot near an outlet that I shared with a friend. The next morning was relaxed. We hung out, played card games, and one of us even brought a GameCube to pass the time. We also had a small projector to play movies on. By lunchtime, we were out of water, so a few of us were sent on a short hike, maybe a mile or so, to refill the water jugs. I ended up carrying them since I was the tallest, but they were too heavy to carry back on foot. Luckily, we found an old cart nearby with large wheels and a wooden platform. We loaded the water jugs on it, filled them up, and managed to wheel them back. By nightfall, though, we needed water again, and instead of waiting until morning, my friend and I were sent out with flashlights to refill them right away. The moment I stepped outside, I felt an uneasy feeling like something was watching us. I tried to shake it off, but I kept hearing faint sounds and seeing shadows in my peripheral vision. When we reached a fenced-off area with canoes, the feeling intensified, and I froze. I told my friend, but he brushed it off. I finally said, "I can't do this. Let's wait until morning." He didn't like it, but agreed to head back. Once inside, I told the troop leader, but he thought it was probably just wildlife. We'd seen coyotes the night before, so that seemed possible. But then my friend taunted me, saying he'd find some real men to go back with him. I couldn't let him get the last word, so we grabbed 2 more friends and an extra flashlight, and we all went back. The uneasy feeling returned as we walked, especially around that canoe area, but we pushed forward. When we reached the water pump, there was an eerie quiet, broken only by frogs by the lake. Shadows stretched out everywhere, and even the flashlight couldn't ease the tension. Heading back, we started to notice strange footprints in the dirt. Then, as we passed the canoes, my friend whispered, "Do you see that?" and took off running. I didn't look back, just ran, even though I was hauling the water jugs. We made it back safely, and once we'd set the water down, I asked my friend what he'd seen. He said he caught a glimpse of a man sprinting toward us, but when he blinked, the figure vanished. I believed him because I thought I'd seen something similar, a dark shape moving in the trees. The next morning, we checked the area, but found only faint, worn footprints. To this day, I'm not sure what we encountered that night. Maybe it was just a strange coincidence, or perhaps someone or something was watching us. I never found out the name of that campsite, but I know I'd never go back because you never really know what's lurking out there in the shadows. About a year ago, my neighbor and good friend, Emma, and I went to a summer camp where we volunteered as counselors for younger kids. The camp was on an island, far from the city, or so it seemed. It was mid-June when we arrived, and everything seemed normal at first, except for the fact that Emma and I's cabin was deeper into the woods than all the others. We had to walk down a long gravel path just to get there. I was naturally curious at that age, so I asked Emma if she wanted to go for a walk in the woods once it got dark, just for the thrill of it. She agreed, and that night we sneaked out, trying not to wake anyone else. We walked down the path towards a large hill we saw in the distance. When we reached the top, I stopped and looked out into the vast fields ahead. That's when we saw it, an object flying toward us. It had 3 red lights, glowing like dots against the dark sky. We were frozen in place, not sure what we were seeing. After a few moments, we snapped out of it and bolted back to the cabin, hiding in a corner for the rest of the night. Eventually, we both fell asleep. The next morning, we confirmed to each other that what we saw was real, but we kept it to ourselves and didn't tell the other counselors. Later that evening, we decided to return to the same spot, this time later than before. When we got there, we saw the same object with the 3 red lights, but it was even closer than the first time. As soon as we noticed it, we screamed. The object vanished, and we rushed back to the cabin, locking the door behind us. We regretted going back that second time, and we spent the rest of the night wide awake, too scared to sleep. In the morning, I turned on the news, and there it was, a report about dozens of other sightings of the same object we had seen, with nearly 100 other people confirming it. It was an actual UFO. Emma's face went pale, and I felt numb. We went to the head counselor to tell them about what happened, but they didn't believe us. All I know for sure is that I will never go back to that camp again. I was driving through the Midwest, looking for somewhere to stop for the night. I'd been on the road for hours, going down back roads with hardly anything around, just fields and trees stretching for miles. Around sunset, I saw a faded sign for a small village not far off. The sign was hard to read, but it said something about renting old cabins. I figured it was better than sleeping in my car, so I decided to check it out. When I got to the village, it felt empty, like it had been abandoned a long time ago. Most of the buildings were old and crooked, looking like they hadn't been touched in years. I found the little office at the entrance, but it was locked and there was no one around. After a few minutes, I noticed a note on the counter telling me to take a key and leave cash in a box. It felt a bit weird, but it was cheap and I didn't mind the quiet. I grabbed the key that said Cabin 3 and started walking toward the cabins. Cabin 3 was a small, old wooden building on the edge of the village, next to the woods. The floor creaked under my feet as I went inside, and the air smelled stale, like the place hadn't been aired out in a long time. There was a small bed, a table, and a couple of old chairs that didn't match. It looked like something from a history book, simple, dark, and with just the basics. As I settled in, I noticed the window was cracked and wouldn't fully close. I tried to push it down, but it was stuck halfway open. I could hear the wind picking up outside, rustling the leaves on the trees. The sound was loud through the broken window, but I was tired, so I didn't think much of it. I lay down on the hard mattress, telling myself I'd leave first thing in the morning. In the middle of the night, I woke up to a soft scraping sound coming from outside. My heart started to race as I lay still listening, It sounded like something dragging across the side of the cabin, like a stick or a branch moving slowly along the wall. I held my breath, hoping it was just the wind or an animal. But the scraping kept going, and it seemed to get closer to the window. I forced myself to sit up, a cold chill creeping up my spine. I looked toward the window, but I couldn't see anything. There was no clear shape, just a feeling that something was out there, just out of view. The scraping sound shifted, moving right under the window. I didn't dare move, just sat there, holding still, feeling like I was trapped. Then, suddenly the noise stopped. The silence felt heavy. I listened hard, trying to hear anything, but all I could hear was my own breathing. After a while, I told myself it was probably just an animal or my imagination getting to me in the quiet. I lay back down, but my heart was still pounding. Just as I was starting to fall asleep again, I heard a faint creak, a sound from inside the cabin. It wasn't loud, but it was clear, like someone stepping on an old floorboard. My eyes snapped open, staring into the darkness. I saw nothing. The creaking came again, closer this time. That's when I realized someone or something had come inside. I reached for my phone, hoping to turn on the light, but it was gone. It wasn't on the table where I'd left it. A wave of panic hit me. Whatever was outside wasn't there anymore. It was inside the cabin with me, watching me from the dark corners. I didn't make a sound, keeping as still as possible, praying they wouldn't know I was awake. The cabin stayed silent, but I could feel the air around me shift, as if something had just moved. The tension in the room was thick. Then, just before the first light of dawn started creeping through the cracks, I heard the sound of footsteps moving away. They weren't loud, just slow and careful, like they were trying to be quiet. I didn't wait to see more. As soon as the first bit of light hit the room, I jumped out of bed, grabbed my keys, and ran out the door. I reached my car as fast as I could. When I looked down, I saw my phone lying on the ground, right outside the cabin. It was almost like someone had left it there for me to find. I didn't stop to think about it. I just got in my car and drove away, not looking back. I kept driving, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. The village, the cabin, it all felt like it was still with me, following me. The whole drive home, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone standing by the side of the road, or worse, in the back seat. My skin crawled the entire way, but I made it back finally safe. But I can't shake the thought that something from that cabin didn't stay there. I don't know who or what it was, but I know it wasn't just my imagination. There are places where things are better left undisturbed. Some secrets don't belong to the living, and I think I found one. I remember when my boss, his wife, and his mom invited me to their cabin for the weekend. It was a small, old cabin deep in the woods, and my boss had been talking about it for months. He said it was a nice place to get away from everything and that I might enjoy the peace and quiet. I didn't really know them that well outside of work, but I figured it wouldn't hurt to go, so I said yes. When we got there, the cabin looked much older than I expected. The wood was dark and worn, and the windows were covered in a layer of dust. There was a strange smell in the air, like the place hadn't been opened in years. My boss said it was a family cabin and that he hadn't brought anyone there except for close family. It felt odd, but I didn't think much of it. I just figured he was trying to make it sound more special than it was. Inside, the cabin was simple and old-fashioned. The rooms were small and had old furniture, and the walls were covered with pictures of people I didn't recognize. It was dim, even though it was still daylight. The wooden floors creaked loudly, and the whole place felt heavy, like it was holding something inside. I didn't know why, but the atmosphere made me uneasy. His mom was especially quiet. She just sat in a corner, staring at me without saying much, which made me feel even more uncomfortable. The first night was really strange. We had dinner together, but it was quiet. My boss and his wife spoke softly to each other while his mother just watched me. She didn't eat much and kept muttering things under her breath, but it was so quiet I couldn't hear what she was saying. It felt like I was intruding on something private, and it left me feeling on edge. That night, I barely slept. My room was right across from theirs, and the walls were thin. I could hear them moving around and whispering to each other. I thought I heard footsteps outside my door, and then the sound of something scraping against the floor. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make me feel like I wasn't alone. I tried to tell myself it was just the house settling or the wind outside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The next day, things only got stranger. My boss suggested we go for a hike, but his mom stayed behind. She sat on the porch, still watching me as we left. The hike through the woods was tiring. My boss and his wife moved quickly, almost like they were trying to lose me in the trees. They didn't talk much, and I struggled to keep up. I kept tripping over rocks and roots, wondering if they even noticed I was falling behind. It felt like they were pushing me further and further away from them. When we finally got back, the atmosphere in the cabin was even more intense. His mother was sitting at the table, waiting for us. As soon as I walked in, she gave me a look, and I swear I heard her say something under her breath. It sounded like a warning, but it was so quiet I wasn't sure. My boss quickly shushed her and then told me to go to my room to rest. I didn't feel like resting. I felt like I was being trapped. Something about this whole situation felt wrong. That night, I heard them whispering again. This time I could make out a few words. They were talking about me, saying something about handling things and not letting anything slip. My stomach turned. I couldn't figure out what they were talking about, but I knew it wasn't good. I felt like they were plotting something, and I was stuck in the middle of it, not knowing what would happen next. Around dawn, I heard footsteps outside my door again. This time, they were heavier, slow, and deliberate. My heart pounded as I lay perfectly still, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped outside my door, and I could feel someone on the other side, listening, waiting for me to make a sound. I wanted to get up and run, but my body wouldn't move. I was too scared to do anything. I didn't want them to know I was awake. The footsteps lingered for what felt like forever. Then they slowly faded away. When the first light of morning finally crept into the room, I knew I had to leave. I grabbed my bag and made sure they were still asleep before slipping out the door as quietly as I could. My hands were shaking as I walked to the car. As I backed out of the driveway, I looked back at the cabin, and that's when I saw them. My boss, his wife, and his mother were standing on the porch, watching me drive away. They didn't wave. They didn't smile. They just stood there, staring with cold, empty eyes, like they knew this was how it was going to end all along. The whole way home, I kept thinking about that moment. The way they looked at me. The feeling that I disturbed something I wasn't supposed to know about. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't just some guest in their home. I was a part of something much darker, something that I wasn't meant to see. I never went back to that cabin. I quit my job not long after, unable to shake the feeling of their eyes on me. I haven't been able to sleep properly since. Sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I feel like they're still watching me. Like they've followed me, somehow, and are still waiting. Waiting for what? I don't know. But I do know one thing. I'll never forget the way they looked at me that morning, standing on that porch, watching me drive away. And I'm sure they're still there, watching, waiting for the next person who dares to enter their world. A few months ago, I decided I needed a break from everything, so I rented a small cabin deep in the Amazon rainforest. It wasn't your typical vacation spot, but I've always liked getting away from people, and this place seemed perfect. I brought my dog, Buddy, along for company. The cabin was far from the nearest town, hidden deep in the jungle. It had only the basics: no Wi-Fi, no cell service, just the sounds of the jungle filling the air. When we arrived, the cabin was a bit older and more run down than I expected. The wood was weathered, and the windows were covered in dust, like the place hadn't been touched in a long time. There was an odd smell, too, like something had been left closed up for too long. I try not to think about it. Buddy seemed on edge, though. Normally, he's curious about new places, but here, he kept close to me, constantly looking around the trees like he was sensing something I couldn't. The first couple of days were quiet. We stuck close to the cabin, mostly walking around the area, not wanting to stray too far. The jungle here felt different, more alive, but in a way that made my skin crawl. There were constant noises, monkeys, birds, insects, but something about it felt off. Every so often, I'd hear a branch crack or rustling in the trees nearby. But when I looked around, there was nothing. It was like the jungle itself was alive, watching us. On the third night, I woke up to Buddy growling low in his throat. He was staring at the window, ears perked, body stiff. At first, I thought it was just a wild animal, maybe a small animal walking around, but there was something unsettling in the air. I listened closely and realized there were footsteps outside, moving around the cabin. Slow, careful steps, like someone or something was pacing the place. My heart started pounding in my chest. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. I held my breath, hoping it was just an animal and not something worse. Buddy kept growling, his eyes locked on the door. Then, after what felt like forever, the footsteps moved away, slowly fading into the dark. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just lay there, my mind racing, every little sound outside making my heart jump in my chest. The whole cabin felt like it was holding its breath with me. The next morning, I found strange marks in the dirt around the cabin. They weren't animal tracks, but they definitely weren't human footprints either. They were wide, deep impressions, like something heavy had been dragged in circles around the cabin. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, maybe a tree branch or something, but a chill ran down my spine. Whatever had made those marks was no animal I knew. That night, Buddy was even more tense. Every noise outside made him bark or growl. He wouldn't lie down, kept pacing the cabin, looking at the door and windows like he was waiting for something. I tried to keep him calm, but I could feel that whatever had been out there before was still close. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again, but this time they were heavier. They moved quickly around the cabin, almost like something was circling us. The air inside felt thick, like something was watching us from the shadows. I didn't know what was out there, but I had a bad feeling about it. Then, I heard a loud thud, followed by scraping sounds, like something was dragging along the outside wall of the cabin. Buddy barked and whimpered, his whole body shaking. I froze, not daring to move or look outside. The scratching sounds got louder, closer to the window. I thought about grabbing my flashlight, maybe stepping outside to see what it was, but something stopped me. A feeling deep inside told me that whatever was out there, I didn't want to see it. I stayed as still as possible, hoping it would leave. The noises stopped after what felt like hours, leaving the cabin in a silence, so heavy it almost felt suffocating. I didn't move. I didn't sleep. I just waited for daylight. As soon as the first light of morning came, I grabbed our things without bothering to clean up. I needed to get Buddy and myself out of there, as fast as I could. When I stepped outside, I saw more of those strange marks in the dirt leading right up to the cabin. This time, they were deeper, and I could see the trail leading back into the jungle. It looked like something had been dragging itself away from the cabin, and I realized it wasn't just one thing, it was something big. Buddy whined, and I felt my heart race again. I threw her stuff into the car and drove off, not stopping until I was miles away from that cabin. I still don't know what was out there, circling the cabin, watching us. All I know is that it wasn't anything natural, and it didn't want us there. And as I drove away, I swear I saw something, just for a second, in the rearview mirror. A shadow, moving between the trees, like it had been following us the whole time. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I can hear those footsteps again. Slow, deliberate, like they're still out there, watching and waiting. I don't know if it's just my mind playing tricks, but I'll never forget the way those marks looked in the dirt, the way the air felt thick with something I couldn't name. Whatever was out there isn't gone. It's still waiting, and maybe it's still watching me, just outside the line of sight where I can't see it. A few weeks ago, I needed a break from the city, so I rented a small cabin deep in the woods. I figured I'd get some peace and quiet. I brought my cat, Max, with me for company. The cabin was really isolated, far away from any town or people. I had always thought being alone in nature sounded great, but I didn't realize how quickly it could feel uncomfortable. When I got there, the cabin looked nice enough, small but cozy. The rain started right when I got out of the car, making everything feel wet and dark. The forest around the cabin was thick with trees, and the leaves above blocked out most of the light. Inside, the cabin was simple: a living room, a kitchen, and a bedroom. There was no phone signal, no Wi-Fi, just the sounds of rain and the occasional bird. It was peaceful at first. Max seemed fine, sniffing around and exploring the cabin like usual. But as the night started to fall, he started acting strange. He seemed really jumpy, pacing around and meowing quietly like he was hearing or sensing something I couldn't. His fur would stand up in spots, and he'd stop and stare at the dark corners of the room, his eyes wide and focused, like he was watching something. The rain was coming down hard now, making a loud sound on the roof. I thought maybe the storm had just spooked Max, so I tried to settle in for the night. But Max wasn't calming down. He kept pawing at me, meowing and running around like he was looking for something or someone. I tried to comfort him, but it felt like he was more nervous with every minute. Around midnight, I heard something weird. A soft tapping sound, like fingernails tapping on the window. I thought it might be the rain or maybe a branch hitting the glass, but when I looked outside, there was nothing. The rain was too heavy for anyone to be out there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Max was completely on edge now. He was crouched low to the floor, staring at the door, his tail twitching. I didn't know if it was just the storm messing with my head or if there was really something outside. But the air in the cabin felt thick, like something was out there, and it wasn't good. Every few minutes, I'd hear that tapping again, sometimes on the window, sometimes on the walls. It didn't sound like wind or rain. It sounded like someone was knocking on purpose, like they were trying to get in. I told myself it was just the storm playing tricks on my mind, but the tapping kept going. It was getting louder, closer. I could almost feel the walls shaking from it. Max was now huddled next to me, his fur standing up, eyes locked on the door like he was expecting something to come through it. I was too scared to move. The storm outside was loud, drowning out everything else, but that tapping, it just kept getting closer, moving around the cabin. It was like whatever was out there was circling the place, looking for a way in. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I kept glancing at the door, half expecting it to fly open at any second. Then, suddenly, the tapping stopped. For a moment, there was complete silence, just the sound of rain hitting the roof. But the silence felt wrong, like everything was holding its breath. I stared at the door, listening hard, waiting for something to happen. Max's fur was still standing on end, and his body was tense. I wanted to get up and check the windows, but I couldn't bring myself to move. It felt like whatever was out there was just waiting for me to make the first move. Then, without warning, there was a loud bang. The door shook like something had hit it from the outside. Max jumped and ran under the table, his eyes wide and frantic. I froze. My breath got stuck in my throat. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. What was that? What was out there? I stayed completely still, too scared to even breathe. The rain was still coming down hard, but the wind had died down, and there was nothing else I could hear except the storm and my heartbeat. It felt like whatever was outside was just waiting for me to make a sound, but I couldn't move. I didn't want to know what was out there. Eventually, I couldn't take the tension anymore. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, trying to force myself to move. Slowly, I crept toward the door, my heart racing. I pulled back the curtain just enough to peek outside. There was nothing, just the rain, the dark trees, and the faint light from the cabin spilling onto the porch. No one was there. No one at all. I checked all the windows and locks, making sure everything was still in place. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. Max wouldn't leave his hiding spot under the table, and he stayed there, trembling. I stayed up the rest of the night, constantly checking every window, every door, even the ceiling, wondering if I was missing something. The tapping never came back, but the unease stuck with me. It was like something was still out there, waiting. The next morning, I packed up as fast as I could. I didn't even finish my coffee. I couldn't get out of that cabin fast enough. I never figured out what caused the tapping or who or what was outside that night. But whatever it wasn't natural. It wasn't the storm, it wasn't an animal. And I don't think it left when I did. Now, whenever I'm alone at home, I sometimes hear tapping at my window. It's light at first, almost like someone's fingernails lightly tapping. I don't know if it's just the wind or something else, but every time, my skin crawls. I'll never forget that night. Whatever was out there in the dark woods is still out there, and I'm pretty sure it's still watching. A few weeks ago, I took a job looking after a cabin in the woods. It was in the middle of nowhere. No neighbors, no cell service, just miles and miles of trees. The cabin was part of a small, private place meant to keep people away from the busy world, and the owner just needed someone to keep an eye on it during the off-season. I thought it would be a nice break and a chance to make some extra cash. It didn't seem like it'd be a big deal, just a cabin in the woods. The place itself wasn't anything fancy. The cabin was old, made of dark wood, with a few rooms and a big stone fireplace. It looked a little run down, but it had a certain charm. The trees around it were massive, tall, and thick, blocking out most of the sun, making the forest feel even more isolated. There were no other houses for miles, and it was the perfect place if you wanted to get away from everything. But I had done this kind of work before, and I wasn't worried about being alone. I figured it'd be a quiet few weeks. The first few days were calm. I spent my time doing simple stuff, cleaning, fixing broken things around the cabin. The only sounds were the wind through the trees and the occasional bird call. There was a peace to it, like the world outside didn't exist. But by the fourth night, things started feeling off. I was in the kitchen, cooking dinner, when I first heard something outside. It was a faint sound, almost like someone walking on dry leaves. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer, but then the sound came closer. It wasn't the random, unpredictable shuffle of an animal. but something more deliberate. I froze. It stopped for a moment, then started again, closer this time. My heart beat faster. It sounded like someone was walking around the cabin, pacing slowly. I grabbed the flashlight from the counter and stood still by the window, trying to see something through the darkness. But all I could see were the black shadows of trees and the falling rain. The wind was strong, making everything feel heavier. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe a lost hiker or some animal. But I couldn't ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. I checked the doors and windows, made sure everything was locked up tight, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. The next morning, I went outside to check. The rain had made the ground soft and muddy, but there were no footprints, no signs of anyone coming close. It didn't make sense. I kept telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Maybe it had been the wind or some animal, but I couldn't shake the unease. That night, the footsteps came back, but this time, they were louder, closer. Whoever, or whatever, was out there was walking around the cabin again. I stayed still, my heart pounding. I wanted to look outside, but something told me not to. The footsteps circled the cabin, slow and steady. They stopped at the door. I waited for a knock, but nothing came. Just silence. The quiet after that felt like it was crushing me. I couldn't sleep. Every sound, even the smallest creak of the floor, made my heart race. I kept hearing noises like something was moving around just outside the cabin. But whenever I checked, there was nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching. The next day, I called the owner, but I didn't tell him everything. I just mentioned that I'd heard some strange noises. He brushed it off, said it was probably just animals. But it didn't feel like animals. I knew what animals sounded like. This was different. That night, I decided to stay in the living room with all the lights on. The wind was howling outside, and the trees were swaying. I sat there, clutching a knife in my hand, trying to stay calm. But then I heard it again, the same soft sound like someone walking in the mud. I could hear the steps, slow and heavy, getting closer to the cabin. I was frozen, not sure if I should hide or check again. The steps stopped, right outside the window this time. I didn't dare look outside. It felt like whatever it was knew I was in there, knew I was watching. I was trapped. Then it changed. The sound wasn't footsteps anymore. It was a tapping, soft, slow tapping, like someone was gently knocking on the side of the cabin. It made my stomach drop. I couldn't stay in there any longer. I had to leave. I grabbed my stuff quickly, went to the door, and opened it, but then I froze. Right outside the door were muddy footprints, huge, deep ones. They weren't there before. They led straight to the door, but no one had knocked. No one had come up to the cabin. I hadn't heard a single sound as those footprints appeared. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and ran around to check all the windows. I bolted them shut, and I sat in the dark, listening. The tapping stopped, but the footsteps kept going. I could hear them moving around the cabin like someone was trying to get in. Every few minutes, I would hear someone walking, slow, purposeful, testing the windows, waiting. I stayed up the whole night, heart racing, not knowing what to do. The sun didn't feel like a relief the next morning. I packed my things as fast as I could and left. I drove down the road, feeling a little safer the further I got from that cabin. But then, as I was driving away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. I swear, I saw something moving in the trees. A figure. It was hard to tell, but it was there. It was watching me, even from a distance. I don't know what it was, but I can't stop thinking about it. Maybe it was a hunter, maybe it was someone else lost in the woods, but I know I'll never go back there. And I don't think I'll ever feel safe again. The thing is, even now, I still get the feeling I'm being watched. Every time I go outside, or when it's too quiet, I can almost hear those footsteps again. Slow, deliberate, always waiting.